to enable Barbara's sound.
Hello?
We are now ready to...
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Welcome to our webinar entitled Fundamentals of Mid-Century Modern Landscape. As we all know, modern architecture eradicated or melded the boundary between indoors and outdoors. It is one of the major concerns of 20th century landscape and modern architecture. Now that has consequences for preservation professionals because the setting is more complicit than ever in evaluating a potential resource. And as we know, the setting is one of the 7 critical aspects of integrity in evaluating a resource. So therefore, it has plenty of implications for us as preservation professionals. In contrast to buildings, which have well-established protocols for restoration and rehabilitation, the restoration and rehabilitation of modern landscape design is something new. Landscapes are alive. Original versions of plans may not be available. Plans and drawings may have long gone. So knowing the history and the design intent become key to thinking about rehabilitation. Our thinking as a group of 6 is that since the rehabilitation of modern landscape architecture is new, we have kind of a responsibility to talk about the history and the design strategies and the design intentions of those architects that came before us 100 years ago. What was fueling the design intent? Only then can we ground our own responses to what is in front of us and think about appropriate strategies to go forward. Our group of 6 comprises landscape architects, practicing professionals, landscape architectural historians, architectural historians, and educators. And you can bio design, so I won't go into that at all really here. But I'd like to begin with our first speaker, Stephen Keewan, who's going to be introducing us with his lecture on transitions to modern landscapes. Thank you, Stephen.
Are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you.
I don't know what happened. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the historic precedent leading up to modern landscape, focusing primarily on the era right before World War II. I think when most people think of modern landscape design, they picture something like the image you see here, the post-World War II garden designed by Phil Shipley. But modern landscape architecture design has a much longer history in California. So I'd like to talk about some of the events that led up to the evolution of modern landscape design primarily in California. For centuries, landscape architecture used geometric, axial architectonic design, primarily sort of organized around views. Later on, there was the informal style. So up to the 20th century, it was really a sort of an argument between formal and informal. By the 1920s in Europe, landscape architects were creating avant-garde gardens based on the geometries of Cubism. But gardens like this didn't really make much of an impression in the United States. This is the garden at the Villa Nuage of the south of France. It really wasn't until the late 1930s when really new concepts in modern landscape design started to be explored and disseminated. One of those happened when these three young men, who were students at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Garrett Ekbo, James Rose, and Dan Kiley, started really resisting what they were being taught, the Beaux-Arts curriculum, and began to explore science, architecture, and art as sources for modern landscape design. They collaborated on a series of really influential articles which got the notice of a wide audience of practitioners. One of their goals was to throw out the axis and other formal means of organizing space, which focused mostly on static views, instead using modern art as an organizing influence of art, and designing functional spaces in 3 dimensions. I think probably the most widely influential thing that happened in the late 30s was the publication in 1938 of this book by Christopher Tunnard, Gardens in the Modern Landscape. In it, Tunnard argued for the functional garden, which embodies a spirit of rationalism and through an aesthetic and practical ordering of its units provides a friendly and hospitable milieu for rest and recreation. And really it's this quote by Tunnard: "The right style for the 20th century is no style at all, but a new conception of planning the human environment," which really embodies what landscape architects practicing prior to World War II in California were going by. Not these really rational or radical ideologies. They were really doing this as a continuation of what had come before. In 1937, the San Francisco Museum of Art hosted the first of its kind in any museum, an exhibit on contemporary landscape architecture, which with models and photographs and plans showed modern landscape design which had been recently produced in California up to then. But some of the key concepts in modern landscape design, like the indoor-outdoor relationship, have always been in place in California. Here's the home of one of the Coahuila Indian tribe near Palm Springs, where the indoor-outdoor relationship is well represented, with even an outdoor room included, the enclosure extending from the structure, giving protection and a comfortable human scale for outdoor living. When the Spaniards conquered California, they brought their own ideas about architecture and landscape, which again emphasized the indoor-outdoor relationship. During the period of the ranchos, homes were built around courtyards, where covered arcades is where most of the family life took place. Beginning in the early 1900s, architect Irving Gill created a new type of architecture inspired by mission architecture, but really cubic forms of tilt-up concrete, art pierced by arches. The indoor-outdoor relationship shows with his pergolas that extend out into the landscape. But he really felt that these blank walls were sort of a canvas where the landscape would, animate the architecture with the shadows of trees and with flowering vines and shrubs. He collaborated with landscape architects like Lloyd Wright and Wilbur Cook to utilize it. Starting in the late 20s and the early 30s, there was a pair of landscape architects you see here, Fred Barlow Jr. and Catherine Bashford. So to illustrate some of the modern design coming out of Southern California in the 30s, and to show some of their work. This is the Pasadena home of Mrs. Daniel Burnham, who was the widow of legendary planner and architect Daniel Burnham. Here, Palmer Staben was the architect, and Bashford and Barlow collaborated with him to site the house so that this fine group of eucalyptus, mature eucalyptus, could be preserved at the back of the house, the patio. Here you see at the rear of the house, there was a solarium which really maximized the indoor-outdoor relationship in some innovative ways. There were glass walls which opened up completely to the eucalyptus-shaded patio. The floor of the house, of the solarium, of the patio, and the lawn beyond were all one level. And you can see here up against the glass walls, on both sides of the glass walls, both inside and out, were planting beds, lighted overhead by skylights for natural light. Another important principle of early modernism was the creation of functional spaces which maximized the land available for use by its inhabitants. Here's a small group of houses by Webster and Wilson where Fred Barlow collaborated for three friends from Caltech who were rabid badminton fans. For the shared backyard, which would contain a joint badminton court you see in the middle, the garages of the houses were moved forward to the street, and this created a barrier on the street side which provided outdoor dining and living spaces adjacent to each house, but afforded the most spacious shared communal recreation behind the three houses. Fred Barlow took this a step further with these 4 single-family home plots, and here in the middle you see shared space which included a swimming pool, badminton court, play areas for the children, and this allowed the families to collectively enjoy recreational features they might not otherwise be able to afford. For this single-family home, he collaborated with architect H. Roy Kelly to create this badminton court in the driveway. So he expanded the area of the concrete area, embedding in it lines for the badminton court. Fred Barlow said that such an enclosed paved area also provides a wonderful place for small children with their wheeled toys, and that with proper planting, this area can be made into a gracious entrance court that will lend dignity to the approach of the house. Another important consideration or innovation that the 1937 show in San Francisco was highlighting was the collaborative process, which they felt was improving architecture and landscape, not only when it included architects and landscape architects, but the clients, artists, sculptors, and so on. This is the Palm Springs residence of Mr. and Mrs. Davidson. And here the design team included the architects Webster and Wilson, landscape architects Bashford and Barlow, and also the interior designer, and Millard Sheets, the famous artist who acted as the color consultant. Sunset Magazine named this house the Ship of the Desert because of its streamlined nautical detail. And as you see here, every room opened out onto either a patio or a balcony or a terrace. The house was designed from the inside out, so the interior design was all built in, and the color palette was organized around this beautiful painting by Ramos Martinez over the fireplace. Fred Barlow believed that the landscape design should not attempt to compete with the inspiring beauty of Palm Springs' natural landscape, saying, quote, "It is inevitable that any garden will be dwarfed by the immensity of its surroundings. It does not compete with the endless vistas and ever-changing colors of the desert and the mountains. How then to treat a garden so that it will not be an incongruous note in such a picture? Simply by relating the garden of the house, making of it a purely architectural feature, and as such limiting its extent by clearly functional consideration. Socially responsible landscapes." Oops, I'm up. So I'll just quickly go through. So they also did socially responsible landscapes. Public housing in the late 30s came about with Clarence Stein and Henry Wright's garden apartments. There were terrible slums in Los Angeles in the 30s. And landscape architects really maximized the space to provide open areas, recreation, so that children could have access to these things. They were also the first integrated communities in the United States, deliberately integrated communities where children learned to live together, to get along, no matter what their background. Baldwin Hills Village used these same Garden City principles for upper middle class and middle class families, with indoor-outdoor relationship. It was environmentally responsible, where grass was only used on some of the property. This is the grass today, so there are 10 acres of turf originally, 20 acres of ground cover. Now it's 30 acres of grass. So my mid-century modern plant that we're sort of showcasing today is Algerian ivy. It's sort of universally despised today, but Fred Barlow Jr. sort of innovated it here. It had been used as a vine before, but here he had special flats of it grown to provide volumetric planes of horizontal texture and color to coordinate with the horizontal lines of the architecture. It's really hardy and bulletproof, and I think if you've ever tried to get rid of it, you can understand that it really is a practical plant. Thank you.
Why did he just go? Why did he? Let's start the presenter.
I assume you can hear it. Can you hear and see me? Okay, how do I get to my slide is the next one?
Okay, no, that was, here we go. We're going to talk about the automobile today. Some of this might relate a little bit to Stephen's comments as well. More than any other introduced element, the automobile has shaped our suburban landscape in Southern California. So we're going to start with a short history of some of the key moments in the development of that landscape. Planning efforts for the automobile in Southern California began at around the same time as the arrival of the Model T Ford in the early 1900s. In 1929, the city of Los Angeles published the Major Traffic Street Plan. This was prepared by landscape architects Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., Harlan Bartholomew, and Charles Henry Chaney. It was a comprehensive plan of streets in Los Angeles, and it contained ideas of great merit, but for the most part, the plan was not implemented. In the late 1930s, the Arroyo Seco Parkway, formerly known as the Pasadena Freeway, was developed to connect downtown Los Angeles with the city of Pasadena. Built alongside the Arroyo Seco seasonal river, the parkway was landscaped entirely with native plants. It was the first freeway in the western United States, and it represented a transitional phase between early parkways and modern freeways. As automobiles became increasingly affordable to ordinary Americans, planners and landscape architects recognized the desirability of separating cars and people. Ideas for taming the car, derived from Clarence Stein's Radburn idea, found expression in multi-unit, modernist garden city planning. The best and most fully developed example of these neighborhood community complexes in Southern California was Baldwin Hills Village, now the Village Green, where pioneering designers, including landscape architect Fred Barlow Jr., which Stephen just talked about, responded by incorporating graceful access and storage for these new vehicular necessities. Ideas for designing the city of motor cars also found their way into recreational planning studies, such as landscape architect Ruth Shellhorn's innovative park designs for the groundbreaking Shoreline Development Study, which combined ideas of Olmsted-like parkway planning with democratic ideals of open space, active open space for the public. In the early 1950s, President Eisenhower transformed the nation with an interstate highway system. The culture of the car became synonymous with the good life in Southern California. This was perfectly symbolized in the coming together of outdoor living and individual freedom, a top-down convertible cruising along the open highway. Nowhere was the presence of the automobile more prevalent than here. Dominant patterns of far-flung suburban development emerged, and landscape architecture responded to the demands of the Southern California automobile culture. Americans were liberated to travel in their newly acquired automobiles to entertainment venues that celebrated the car itself, such as Disneyland, where park visitors drove to the park on a freeway, then stood in line at Autopia to drive miniature cars through a miniature cloverleaf on a miniature freeway, here envisioned by such landscape architects as Ruth Shellhorn and Jack and Bill Evans. And Dodger Stadium, where landscape architect Art Barton introduced champagne bowls of colorful flowers, which were thoughtfully matched to the admission tickets of fans, giving them an easy way to find their parking levels. And shopping centers, which came to symbolize this new era of comfort, prosperity, and individualized mobility. The most memorable of these destinations in post-war Southern California was the chain of Bullock's department stores and Bullock's Fashion Square shopping centers, with original landscape designs by Ruth Shellhorn. These included 4 freestanding department stores located in Pasadena, Palm Springs, Los Angeles on Wilshire Boulevard, and Lakewood in Lakewood Center, and 4 Fashion Square shopping centers located in Santa Ana, Sherman Oaks, Torrance at the Del Amo, and La Habra. These centers and department stores rank among Shellhorn's best work and became a virtual primer for top-notch commercial landscape design for the automobile. Bullock's Pasadena was the first of these stores and was hailed as a bellwether project when it opened in 1947. It was the first modern department store in the region to be located in the suburbs and one of the first of a genre to explicitly embrace the automobile. Everything about this new Bullock spoke to a fresh, innovative style of California living. The project architect, Welton Beckett, designed the department store to emphasize open space, horizontality, and convenience for drivers, and he utilized a
Yes, thank
streamlined
you, Barbara. Can
design
everyone hear me
informed
okay?
by the same aesthetic that created the low-slung,
my volume
post-war
coming through okay?
automobiles that would park there.
Okay, thank you.
Shellhorn's
so
site and landscape
this period that we're
design
talking
further
about
acknowledged the
of
significance
mid-century modernism,
for newly mobile
which
shoppers,
I guess we would
creating
probably
multiple
define from the
vehicular access points onto the property.
mid-30s to mid-60s,
She conceived of the ideal
began
shopping
in the landscape
experience as a
architecture
progression,
field
one that
in a
began
very
even
conservative
before the
way.
store itself came into
Landscape
view,
architecture was
and one
kind of
that's
late to the
capable of
party
building
as far
up
as
a level of
modernism.
excitement and anticipation
When
as the
ECPO
automobile approached and entered the property.
started
In
his
this end,
studies
she
out
used
at
tall vertical
Berkeley,
elements, such as a trio of Washington palms,
apparently it was a
or a
very
drift of airy eucalyptus trees,
conservative, not
to
very
create a skyline
challenging
and beckon
program.
customers in their
It
cars
was
from
still,
several
as I
blocks
say,
away.
following Beaux-Arts, neoclassical garden design.
Whatever the
And
size or
when he
location of the parking
advanced on to
area,
Harvard
the
in the
customer's
late
first
30s,
view of the property when
all of a
she turned
sudden,
into the street was a carefully
with
composed
the influence of
scene that said
Walter
welcome.
Gropius as dean and the architecture department
Even in
embracing
small
modernism,
areas, she placed lush
he and his
landscaping
colleagues,
with bright
Stephen
shots
mentioned
of
earlier,
color around spatially generous entrances to announce the
and
automobile's
Kylie
arrival.
and James Rose, they apparently
The
they
consideration
got
of
the nickname of the
automobile
Harvard
storage
Rebels
was an
because
inevitable
they were
component in
just
the development of
dissatisfied
Shellhorn's
with the status
landscape
quo.
design.
So they
Shellhorn viewed parking areas as an opportunity
sought
to provide an oasis,
some sort of a different
a
path,
relief
and they
from the
didn't quite know where they were
necessity of
headed,
acres
but
of asphalt,
they embraced
concrete, and the glinting metal of the cars
something
that parked
that I
there.
have not really seen happen
At
much
Bullock
since in
Santa
the
Ana,
landscape
she
architecture
accomplished
field,
this by giving
and
shade
they turned
and
their
breathing
attention
interest
to
these
modern
areas
art.
with summer
And
yellow
of course,
flowers
modern art had
rusty
been
colored fall
what we call
capsules,
modern art
Chinese
had
plane
really
trees.
been
And she planted
evolving
show
since the
stopping
beginning of the
drifts of
century.
profusely flowering Cape chestnut trees.
And I'd like to start with this first
landing
slide.
island, pleasantly
One
distracted
of the
drivers
first
from the
influences they
task at
turned
hand.
to was Kazimir Milovich.
These were beautifully
And
resolved design
you can see
solutions,
how
but they were for an
there's sort of a
automobile-centered post-war
deconstructivist
era that had
aspect
been
to his
ended.
work.
In his recent Los Angeles Times article, architecture critic Christopher
Another
Hawthorne
influence was
maintains that Los
Laszlo
Angeles
Moholy-Nagy,
successfully
and
introduced public transit.
certainly you see things starting to come apart in his compositions, and there's a blocky sort of a quality to it. And I think you would agree that it has a very dynamic sort of approach to art.
He suggests that we are now returning to
these young
examine our old
landscape architects,
paradigms of planning
Ekbo,
efforts,
Rose,
such
Kylie,
as
and some others,
Mobility Plan
they were very
2035,
inspired by this.
in order to
It was
peacefully
a
coexist with
complete
increasing
departure from what they were used to,
congestion.
where everything
The
was very
changes will
symmetrical,
require a
everything was
shift in our
very
thinking about how
neoclassical.
we live in and navigate the street site
So,
designs of our city, but will
They
hopefully
really
preserve
started to
some of the
figure out
best
how they
design
could use this
features
for
of the old
inspiration.
ways. I'm happy
This
to have
is
shared with you where it all started.
I'm sorry, I think I'm advancing by mistake. Okay, yes. This is a composition, it's known as Composition 8 by Vasily Kandinsky, and you see it goes even further with that deconstructivist, blowing apart dynamic sort of a look. And one of the most telling examples that Mark Fried highlights in his book about Ekbo is comparing this, which was done by Kandinsky, with this landscape plan by Ekbo about 23 years later. And you can see how there are all these disjointed elements and arcs, circles, and so forth. And I think they actually had the excitement of turning two-dimensional work into the three dimensions, of course, with retaining walls and seat walls and so forth, and starting to create outdoor spaces. One of the driving factors of Ekbo's work was that he was tired of the decorative aspect of landscape architecture, and he wanted to, just like the modernist architects, he wanted to create spatial qualities, focus on the space that was being created, and all these forms, extruded into three-dimensional forms, gave them that opportunity to do so. Similar to the way an expressionist painting seems to go beyond the canvas, we started to see devices used where the property boundaries or the parameters of a contained garden were ignored. It was just creating a sense of spilling out beyond it without any limits. So you would see control joints in concrete, which of course we know are necessary for the nature of concrete, the way it expands and contracts, expands and cracks, excuse me. So back in those days, of course, they typically used redwood 2x4s as a control joint, and it could be used in decorative ways, and you'd often see them turned at arbitrary angles like this. ECFO liked to use all of these exciting angles. This is the Coolish Garden. I believe it was in Bel Air in the early 50s. And very much in contrast to what most of us consider modernist garden design today. He was not afraid of all of these arbitrary angles and trapezoidal shapes and just sometimes fun, whimsical shapes. It was a little bit of a less serious intellectual approach than the building architects took. Robert Royston, who was a partner with ECFO for some years before going out on his own, they were contemporaries, you'd see him use some of these philosophical ideas. I believe this is Mitchell Park, I'm not sure. And so these windbreaks, they create a sense of privacy, a subtle sense of privacy, and they're not connected to anything. And they're using a geometrical device, if you will, that was very popular then. We don't seem to employ much anymore of tangent and circle, tangent and radius. So much like the paintings I showed you, there were all these disjointed parts as part of this modernist vocabulary in the garden and in the landscape. While ECFO was at Harvard, he took on a project that he wanted to take however many gardens you see there, 14, 16, what have you, and show how they could all be designed differently to expand their filling of space. So if you look at them carefully, he's taken a different approach with each of them to, again, the lines of where the perimeters of the gardens are, so they don't feel so enclosing. On the top middle, you'll see one in particular with a zigzag, or maybe you could call it a ziggurat pattern, that he had picked up from an earlier design, a French modernist design of several decades earlier. And this is one of the drawings that accompanies it. That same pattern. One of the things that we should keep in mind with the landscape architects is that they were taking a pure art form that these expressionist artists were creating, and they were melding it into practical uses. In other words, if a stairway splayed out at some arbitrary angle, there would normally be a reason for it. It was because you wanted to funnel people from a certain direction, or you wanted to fan them out in a certain direction. So here, what ECFO has done is create that zigzag pattern to sort of borrow the neighbor's garden, so they each get the benefit of that device. I'm sorry for jumping around here. Okay, here we go. This is another ECFO garden where it really emphasizes the planar quality that they were after to create spatial qualities, and it provides a really great foil for the very free-form sculpture you see in the foreground there. So that was another thing that the landscape architects would do. They would mix and match these different vocabularies, unlike you might see in a particular distinct painting. And this very rectilinear, maybe we could call Neutra quality, has just been embraced and repeated again and again. This is in a more contemporary design for a large building trellis. But even Neutra, who we equate with a very precise horizontality and verticality, he even wanted to employ the biomorphic shapes in his designs. This is at the Perkins house with this palm that meanders in and out through the glass. And some of the other buildings that he created, he would throw in an interesting sort of a curve shape to do a front facade and so forth. So although we think of modernism being all orthogonal, it was quite beyond that, especially in those days. Here is a pool garden that Ekbo created, and I'm happy to say that this is actually in great shape today, unlike many of these gardens that fall victim to the elements and neglect. It's in Laurel Canyon, and it's been restored, and it looks just like that today, but the obvious inspiration there is Piet Mondrian. And you would see how it would trickle down to the masses with blocky colors. So this would be the sort of thing you'd see in home and garden type feature articles of the day. But again, you notice I keep going back between this orthogonal inspiration and the biomorphic. This is a mobile by Alexander Calder. He was a great influence on these designers, as well as Jean Arc, who was probably best known for this very organic sort of sculpture. But early in his career, he would do these wooden reliefs, and I wonder if perhaps this is where Ekbo started to get the idea of turning this abstract art into 3 dimensions, just like Arp was starting to experiment with. So the sort of geometries that you would see in some of the gardens back then that were done by very talented hands, this is another Ekbo garden, are things that we might think are there's no form, there's just rough curves and all, but what he was actually doing was mimicking the sorts of free-form biomorphic shapes like we just saw in this earlier sort of Jean Arc. We can't talk about the mid-century modernists without talking about Tommy Church. Thomas Church actually preceded Ekbo by about 10 years, and Ekbo worked briefly in his office. Robert Royston was there much longer. So a lot of the folks that made an impact in the mid-century went through Church's office. Here he is standing in front of one of his most noted designs, a beach garden, and you can see how on the left he's playing with the orthogonal with the seat walls, and on the right it's very organic. And one of the things that makes this garden, by the way, so noted is that rather than a lawn space for the children of the house, he decided to just bring sand up and use that instead, which is pretty innovative at the time. Another lesser known garden by Church. You can see that with the planter on the side, it's very arbitrary angles. And I think one way you could define a modernist garden back in the day compared to a neoclassical garden is that the geometry is unresolved. And what I mean is by that is, so you see churches using this fun kind of question mark shaped curve to the lawn edges, but there's no symmetry to it. There's no, it kind of keeps us on edge. It provides a playful kind of attention, whereas with a formal garden, like Stephen was showing earlier from the French formal gardens like Versailles or Vaux-le-Vicomte, there was a clear symmetry, and it would look like something was missing. Of course, Church is known for, most especially for the Dunel Garden. We don't need to go into that much, but one of the last architects, landscape architects I'd like to talk about is Roberto Burle Marx from Brazil, and he had a very distinctive vocabulary that he'd employ with both plant material and paving, all this dynamic paving examples you can see here. And he had a very painterly approach. What made Burle Marx unique is that he was a very accomplished painter and sculptor as well as a landscape architect, and he relied on both to inspire himself. More Burle Marx work here. He was a muralist often, and that would probably have some bearing on why murals and mosaics became a very commonly used component in garden design back in those days. So when it came time to plant material, the landscape architects would have on their plant palette would include some very architectural plants, as we often call them, things that would make a little punch, like an expressionist painter might use on his canvas, yuccas and aloes and so forth. Equisetum is a quite different sort of a plant that does well in water and as well as dry areas, and you often see used today as well. One of the last influences I want to mention here, of course, was Pablo Picasso, and his early work looked like this, and some decades later, as he evolved, he became a little bit more commonly known for this Cubist type of work. But you can see how the landscape architects were inspired by this with blocky colors and biomorphic shapes, as well as gardens that could be viewed from all different angles. They weren't limited by the sort of designed viewing perspective that a formal garden would have had previously to that. A Russian sculptor who clearly had a lot of influence on Ekbo's work was his name escapes me now. I believe it's well, I'm not even going to guess at it, but this was a Russian sculptor in the early part of the 20th century, and you'll see this was his work, and as well as this. And when we get to the Fulton Mall in Fresno, which is has been struggling to be preserved, you can clearly see the influence on Ekbo with the sculptural aspects, as well as in the bottom left, again that free form, almost biomorphic shape. Perhaps the last garden, the most notable garden that was Ekbo's was what was known as the Alcoa Garden. In the post-war years, the Alcoa Company, Aluminum Company of America, wanted to highlight civilian uses for that wartime material. So they went to famous architects, and in this case, Ekbo was quite well known from all of his publishing. He had published 2 books at that point, and he thought, well, let's just use my own backyard to experiment with it. So this is an early plan, and you can see how it was built out. He played with all the different forms of aluminum that were available to him, extruded and colored and all that. I had the benefit to actually see this garden about a year ago, and unfortunately, it has not survived well. That's a perspective early on when you see on the left a very abstracted flower-type fountain made of cast aluminum, or made of aluminum plate. And the way it looks today, there are just a few remnants of it that only someone who's familiar with Ekbo would recognize. So that's the predicament that we deal with these gardens. They can easily fall victim to erosion and weather and plant growth and all the sorts of misguided decisions that can be done bit by bit. The plant that I chose to share with you all is something that I thought might be more unique to my part of the country, on the East Coast here, Fatsia, or Fatsia japonica. It's a very tropical-looking plant, but it survives our Zone 7 winters here quite well, and has a bold texture which I think works well in modernist landscapes. Thank you.
I liked that. Mm-hmm. The variation.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Barbara.
Hi. Ted, that was absolutely fascinating with all those different influences and the rejection of symmetry and especially the ambiguity of lack of resolution. Thank you very much. It's interesting that you speak to Roberto Burle Marx. He and the person I'm going to be speaking about, Richard Neutra, were great, great friends. And there were at least 2 projects in which Marx and Neutra collaborated. So that was very, very good to see his work in your presentation. My presentation, I hope it's below, coming here. I'm going to be talking about Neutra's sources in his landscape design, so I'm going to go way back into the 19th century and then way back before that. In the 19th century, is the slide proceeding down? Did I page down? Are you all looking at a bucolic view of a park? I hope, okay. I hope so. This is the Franklin Park in Boston, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And it's a good representation of a movement in the 19th century that was all about the creation of public parks and open spaces and the opportunity to ameliorate the dark satanic mills of Victorian industrialization. A land economist and theorist, architectural critic, Werner Hegemann, in his book, 1911 book on Parkbuch, he writes about the satisfying feeling of the endless that many people on both sides of the Atlantic were trying to introduce into public parks. Leibrecht Miggy, another important horticulturalist and theorist and botanist, was also doing the same thing in this diagram that for one of his books, the growing settlement according to biological principles, written in 1932. And you can tell from the image below that, Birkenhead Park, which is just outside of Liverpool. Thank you, Rhett Beavers, for introducing me to that. That was designed by Joseph Paxton, whom might ring a bell because he designed what is considered the grandfather of the modern movement, Crystal Palace in London. And notably, on this design, it was no less than Frederick Law Olmsted who wrote the encyclopedia entry. And you can tell from the plan that there are curves and copses of trees that are alternating with broad swaths of open land. And another factor was the role of evolutionary biology that was beginning to be a well-respected discipline early in the 20th century. And here again, we have a different kind of research and investigation into this of the endless. And here you see the acacia tree, the horizon line, and the copses of trees in the background and the scudding clouds. Now, one of the most important mentors for Richard Neutra was the Swiss botanist, horticulturalist, and garden designer named Gustav Amend, who is now revered in Switzerland. His 1955 book, the very first photograph in the book, is of the distant horizon and that element of nature as being foremost and most important. And as you can see, this is the Bailey House, the case study house by Richard Neutra, 1947. You can see that that in his drawing, at least, Neutra is raising the canopy well above the roof line of the house, just like the acacia tree in East Africa. Now, when we have the public park with the feeling of the endless, but how do we introduce aspects of the public park, including, as Stephen mentioned earlier, a more functional aspect to park design, to the private garden, to single-family houses and public housing? Here you see Gustav Amann, his design for his own house, in which you have a savanna-like flatness, very locally available plants, nothing exotic. The flat coping around the reflecting pool, and the larger shrubbery bordering the house. And below that, you see the Amann solution, father and son, for public housing, Sonnige Hof, a sunny place, where there are linked gardens, short gardens in front, and more extensive gardens in the back of each dwelling unit. Leibrecht Miggy has become a key character for me. And as you can see, he's probably one of the only people to put a series of cabbage on the front part of their book. And here you have the idea of jedermann Selbstversorger, meaning everyone can do it for themselves. To be more self-reliant, just like the farmer, and bringing that quality of working for oneself with fruits and vegetables in an urban environment. This Leibrecht Miggy and Neutra shared the same idea of a search for type and locating plantings, in contrast to introducing exotic specimens that were the highlight of kind of the Victorian approach. And here you see the site plan, one of Neutra's site plans for the Haley House, 1959, in which Neutra is using numbers 2, 4, and 6 to designate the height and locations of plants rather than specific names. However, Neutra knew his plants. He had dug up young plants for Amann, built plywood models, and altogether got himself thoroughly filthy working in the earth. On the left, you see his plant schedule for his 1921 forest cemetery outside of Berlin. And on the right, I love this title, The Suggestive Plant List, for much later iterations of kind of the types that he was looking for in plants. Now, so far I've been talking about qualities of California, more or less, but we also, well, I'm sorry, beyond California. But I'd like to talk a little bit about more elements that are unique to Southern California thinking. Neutra concludes his 1927 book, Deep Out America, with the image of what he called Die Wüste, which means the wilderness. And it's not quite the same thing in German as it is in English. There is a real sense of something that is beyond our control. But Die Wüste, with great swaths at the horizon and these great open spaces, were very, very important to Neutra and his colleague Rudolf Schindler. The role of Japan was also critical for Neutra, Schindler, as well as the Green and Green brothers, many other people. And here you have the transition into the landscape through meandering stepping stones. So, once again, we find it not in the Neutra book, but in Luene Gärten, the 1955 book by Gustav Amann. On the right we have the Citron House by Richard Neutra, where you see a sequence. You can see a sequence of steps in. Let's see if I can get the pointer, but it's in the lower right of the lower left rather of the site plan. There it is, over here. Well, no, on the other side. Anyway, you can see this studied, intentional, processional quality happening as we go toward the entrance. You can also see this idea of the processional, the more, or whether it's informal, as it was in the Citron House, or more informal, as we can see it in the Elliott House, Bedford, Ohio. I think we're joined today by owner Greg Kinselman, who very kindly afforded me these plans. But here we see the slow procession with this stepping stones informally toward the entrance. And then that also slows us down so that we can exploit and harness the physical act, the body in motion as we lead throughout the house, and then are afforded a brilliant view on coming out on the bottom left of that site plan there. I don't know how to use this pointer. And of course, Richard Neutra is well known for his book Mystery and Realities of the Site, early 1950s, in which he celebrates the genius loci for every site and its careful consideration. He was well known for walking and stalking and altogether badgering his clients, moonlight or in daylight, to walk a site, to understand its parameters from every orientation. As he said, one must experience the site both during the day but also every night. The Goldman House is on the right. That is the site plan for the Goldman House, part of one of Neutra's books that mentions Wohnung. And this has another sequence, a very highly sequenced procession. Again, when you approach a house slowly, your rhythm slows, and you become more aware of the transitions physiologically as you move through space and as you go into a house step by step. Okay, I'm going to conclude with a couple of Neutra strategies, real and not real, depending on what your definition of real is. At the Claremont Methodist Church, rather than the traditional gaudy or not chancel at the front of the church, Neutra's idea of a chancel is no less than the San Gabriel Mountains beyond. Originally there were bird feeders out there so that if you were bored with the sermon, you could always avail yourself of life and moving clouds and arguing birds outside beyond the preacher. But almost more interesting to me is this strip of this upside down clear story. There's a biblical verse that reads, that the Lord will provide a light unto my path. And in fact, here Neutra is giving us a light unto our feet. And what's more, he's introducing usually what landscape architects would prefer that you not see, which are roots and earth and detritus, that which is growing from the ground plane. Neutra continued to always view landscape architecture as another opportunity for research. This article I came across finally, it was like manna for me when I found it, when he is trying to evaluate the implications of his thinking psychologically and physiologically on the user. So this is a little scene from the second VDL house, the Fondalua Research House in Silver Lake, 1967, in which he is incorporating reflecting pools, even things like hanging pots of plants, in order to simultaneously provide you with a tranquil setting that is also in which you are also kinetically engaged. In conclusion, I'd like to show you a very special way that Neutra introduced and furthered this endless view into a private home. On the left, this is the Atwell House in Northern California, 1948. On the left, you see what appears to be this opening beyond the chair that continues on and on and on. In fact, that is a full-height mirror. And you can see that the mirror, where I have the little red arrow there, and the full-height glass, perfect, thank you, and the full-height glass around it. So Neutra is implementing those ideas that are originating in evolutionary biology in people like Werner Hegemann, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Leibrecht Migi, and bringing them all the way into the mid-20th century. And with that, I'll conclude, and I will give my space over to Rhett Beaver, who's going to be talking about a specific aspect of ECFO's work, which are the Lakewood parks. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, we'll turn on my webcam. Yes, I can. Webcam is on. It is now. There it is. Okay, now we're good. Oh, I forgot to introduce my flashcard. This is the same one that Ted Cleary has, coincidentally, but this was a favorite of Richard Neutra's, and there's something so common about it. As Ted mentioned, it kind of grows anywhere. The fascia come from etymologically from 8 fingers, and Neutra used it as kind of a mini Burle Marx moment to animate and temper and offset and contradict the orthogonals in his rectilinear architectural form. So it's a very happy plant, and so common that I had to choose it. All right, thank you.
This is Rhett Beavers. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to everyone. Boy, this is a great history lesson, and I'm going to speak about, as Barbara said, a specific set of Garrett Egbo projects. And before I start, I'd like to say a couple of things. I think 2 points I really want to make on this talk, and one is that the simplicity, at least in the case of Mr. Egbo's parks in Lakewood, the clarity, the simplicity, the simple materials, the geometric forms, the extension of lines from buildings, all exist today. And because it is so simple and it is so clean, that the good people in Lakewood have resisted the urge to redo their parks and make them completely, modern 2000, 1980s, whatever, because the work is so clean and so simple and so good that the parks exist essentially in a not very altered condition. And so that's a testament to the clarity of design. And the second thing I want to speak about are, I think that we should keep in mind while I'm going through this very short presentation, is that the Neutra houses, the Egbo parks, the churches, the schools that are all essentially very highly visible modernism, I think should be considered by planners, and I'm addressing this to planners primarily at this point, that they're indicator species, right? They indicate that you're in an area that is of a certain area in a certain time, right? So the images that you're seeing speak about the idea the war is over, some men are returning home, they're not going to live on the farm anymore. How do we house these new families, right? And so the image on the right is very, very clear. It talks about a GI family still in uniform, the little baby, the wife, and they're looking at the house with the white picket fence, and they're not going back to the farm, right? And so what do we do with these people? Especially in California, many service people trained in California were shipped out of California. When the war is over, you know, they weren't going to go back home, and so they found Southern California to be such a lovely place, such an idyllic place that they moved here. Thank you. One of the solutions, and it's a temporary solution, and this is in Los Angeles, is called the Roger Young Village, and it's it's Griffith Park now. It no longer exists, but this was temporary housing, refurbished Quonset huts, arrayed in a completely military grid form, and this was housing that was having to make do until enough housing was generated in the city of Los Angeles. Now, the goal was that this Roger Young housing would not last forever, and the good news is that it didn't. And what took its place? Well, you know, there are whole cities that have sprung up, and I think probably the best known is Levittown in New York, and Levittown was certainly the predecessor of these towns. This town was planned in the 1940s, right after World War II, and started being built in 1950. It's about 9 square miles. It was home to about 70,000 people. And this is a really unique situation because the whole city is built as of this era, right? And so there's nothing from the 20s, there's nothing from the 30s, there's nothing from the teens. Everything in this entire city of 70,000 people is mid-century and mid-century modern, right? And so I think that virtually every city in America has areas that were the far suburbs at one time, but now are probably in close, that are the miniature versions of Lakewood. Now, Lakewood chose, as a new town, to hire Garrett Egbo to design some parks. And this image shows, this was in Life magazine, and it shows the mass production, the rolling mass production that was begun at Lakewood. They're essentially teams of workers that followed each other in waves. The first people cleared the site, the second people came in and made, poured concrete, people poured the footings, and the next people came in and built rough walls. And so they moved on block after block after block. I mean, this was just a blitzkrieg of housing. And so it is really, not only was it large-scale housing, but it was mass-produced housing, and essentially much of it very, very, very similar. So in 1955, Garrett Egbo is asked to design some parks, and one of the things that and this is his original drawing, and one of the things that we see is that there are very, very, very simple forms. There's semicircles, there's squares, there's rectangles, there's lines, and there's not the modernist. There's not Kandinsky in this park, right? Although Egbo was really good at the modern art and being influenced by people like Kandinsky, when it came to these larger municipal landscapes, you know, his work tended to be much clearer and much simpler. And so because of the simplicity of it, what we're going to do is go to the next slide and, you know, go out there and 65 years later, which is well beyond the 50-year minimum for historic preservation, 65 years, find ourselves standing under that same canopy that's still there, with the same concrete that's still there, with the same trees that were planted by ECBO that are still there, the same building in the background that was the community center is still there. The only thing that's really changed in this park is that they've taken out some of Mr. ECBO's play equipment and superimposed new play equipment that meets ADA. But they resisted the urge to rip out all of the concrete and rip out all of the overhead structures and all the stuff for essentially resisted the urge of new lamps for old. So another park is Simon Bolivar Park, also 1955. And we were there a few weeks ago, and you know that sign there on the left is you know the original sign from the 1950s, at least the original style. On the right is a picnic shelter.
Completely? Pavilions and Haggins is completely closed? No one else is going to take it over? No, that's what Zoma says. I didn't know that was going to happen on December 1st. It happened, guys. They're still trying to work it out. Okay, so you got your well, that's what I'm talking about in the panel. You know, through that first time that we had the students here, the first time we realized that the person you contact.
Okay, are we connected now? Oh, great. Thanks for your patience. I wanted to say it's such a pleasure to be here today. I wanted to thank Barbara for suggesting this idea because it's led to a really wonderful tour of the ECBO parks that Rhett just described and several very nice dinners with the panelists and a rich discussion. My segment of the webinar is going to focus on the landscape renovation of Richard Neutra's Hafley House. The Hafley and Neutra houses are unique in Neutra's body of work in that they were designed as a pair. Mrs. Hafley was the instigator. She had seen Neutra's work and wanted him to design their new custom home in Long Beach. Neutra's response was that he would work for her if she could interest a neighbor in participating. So Mrs. Hafley is the patron for this very unique part of Neutra's body of work. Here you see the two houses designed in 1953 that are shown as part of an ensemble. The plan, by the way, is from Neutra's, or is from Barbara's encyclopedic book on Neutra. The houses have shared characteristics. Each has a living space that's focused on private garden. And they similarly share a vocabulary of planar walls that are bright white plaster, richly colored wood, or paint. You can see at the bottom of the slide they share an entry in a pergola structure. Neutra explored the idea that they would share the rear garden. So the open space across the back was always intended to be available to both houses. The pool that's shown on the upper right was never implemented. And here you see a little bit of the neighborhood context. The project is in a planned community in the southern part of Long Beach. Because of community restrictions, Neutra was required to use community-wide guidelines that require setbacks for the houses and pitched roofs on the two-story elements of the project. The very charismatic quality of the architecture, I think, is coming across in this photograph, which was taken after the interior had been restored by Kelly Sutherland McLeod Architecture.
The project has received numerous awards for the very high quality of their work. And in the background, you can see the garden before we started our work on the landscape. Basically, it's a green wall. Characteristic features of Neutra's architecture include the continuous band of windows with aluminum frames. What was really unique to me about this house is, of course, the pitched roof, the depth and richness of the colors. And then there's this incredible moment where you see the polished soffit and the reflection landscape and this very, very long, beautiful line, which really became the starting point for our design. So here are some photographs of the conditions when we began our work. Here you see the Moore House is on the left-hand side of the slide, and our client's house, the Hafley House, is on the right. So the houses are owned by two separate individuals, and our commission was to work on the Hafley House. One of the guidelines for our design direction was that very nice olive tree that you see on the Moore House on the left-hand side of the slide. Both the houses had very water-intensive landscapes, which is something very characteristic of mid-century landscape design here in Southern California. So here you see the use of turf grass in the parkway and the front garden. And then you also see the dying Brazilian pepper tree that was planted very, very close to the house foundation. The existing private patio space for the Hafley House was also very water intensive and with a pretty small paved area for entertainment. There's the usual kind of mishmash of subtropical plants and a very overgrown hedge that makes the property feel very small. And here you see the visually shared space at the rear of the house. One of the things about the planning of this project that makes it so unique is the deliberate disregard of the property lines. We'll see that, a little bit more of that in subsequent slides. And here you see the entry to the Moore House on the right-hand side of the image. This is probably the weakest moment in the design when we began work, because you come up to the Moore House and then you see there's just a little hedge and you turn right and go into the house. This is an awkward condition that I'm glad that we were able to address. As is sometimes the case with Neutra's projects, the Hafleys ran out of money before they could implement the landscape. So, as I mentioned before, the pool was never constructed, and the only real documentation is the site plan that you see here, which does indicate grades. And there's some correspondence with Neutra where he tells the Hafleys to use plants that belong together. So it really was, to some degree, a blank slate. So this diagram shows how we began to think about the landscape character zones. As I mentioned, we were contracted to work on the Hafley House, which is on the right. But the owners were totally on board with the idea that the landscape should be used to reinforce the connection between the two houses. So that's why the yellow zone of the front garden shows the Moore House as well as the Hafley House. And the owner of the Moore House was very cooperative in the suggested changes to her landscaping that would help the house read as a unit. So our goal was really to reinforce the relationship of the two paired buildings. The other goals for the project include making the project much more drought tolerant, low maintenance, and selecting materials with rich colors and textures that would complement Neutra's design. And the design for the front garden was really the biggest design challenge. We wanted to remove the lawn that had been there and make the landscape much more drought tolerant. And we decided that mounding would tie in with the olive tree on the Moores side of the property. So we have a flat gravel area that is framed by new berms, and those are the new peppermint willow trees, native sedges, and agaves. And here you see the shared entry with the happy house on the right. We replaced the planting that had existed there with something that's much more porous, that maintains a spatial connection between the two houses. And here's the new video for the Hackley house, reflecting the linearity of the architecture. There's original paving that was preserved adjacent to the building. It's dark brown, smooth paving. And then we specified a paving that would complement that is evidently different from the original paving. It's exposed aggregate. And there's another view of the landscape looking toward the living room. So the goal really was to create a feeling of space that complements what Neutra achieved inside the house. The ground plane is defined by gravel, the stepping stones, and on the right you see a weeping brush tree with really brilliant red flowers several times during the year. And here's the view of the visually shared lawn. We retained that feature but replaced the lawn with a drought-tolerant native grass. And here's the new entry to the Moore house. Where there had been a glass panel before, we were able to remove that and introduce these pendulous acacia trees, vocabulary right up to the front door. And now we're back in the living room looking out to the new landscape, which was completed just over a year ago. It's more user-friendly, it's low water use, low maintenance, and we hope that it complements Neutra's design. Neutra was a philosopher-architect whose work articulated his vision of a built environment that was both nurturing and inspiring. It has been a joy to work within the physical, intellectual, and emotional setting that he created. Thanks for your time today. Oh, I've got my flash.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, my flash card is Goya tenuifolia, the Korea grass, here used at another of Neutra's structure. And I just love the playful way that this glass complements the linearity of mid-century design. Thank you.
Hello? Are we back on now, John? Hello?
You're back on right now.
Okay. Everyone, I think we could all turn our mics back on now and open the discussion up to our attendees. Are we all back?
I'm here.
Yes, we're all back. So, Barbara, this is John. I will suggest that the speakers keep themselves muted until they answer a question, just for sound control reasons.
Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question of the speakers? If not, I'd like to kind of talk to ask Stephen about what his concerns are, since we've been talking about this over the last few weeks, but what his concerns are in rehabilitating modern landscapes.
Well, I think some of the issues are that a lot of the plant materials that post-war landscape architects used and that were loved by the public are sort of tropical and subtropical plants that really don't make a lot of sense today, and the proliferation of grass, which again doesn't make a lot of sense today. So I think one of the issues, and Lisa is probably the best to speak to, how do you maintain the design intent and the vision of the landscape architect, but do it in a more drought-tolerant way? So I think that's the primary issue. The other thing is, I think it was mentioned earlier, but a building or a chair, it's easier to read why a building might be modern. And once the building's completed, if no one really monkeys with it, it remains static. So you can go back 65 years later, and the building pretty much looks like it was intended to by the architect. A landscape, though, the materials, for the most part, if it's not the hardscape, will always continue to grow and to change. And so even if it's maintained to the landscape architect's vision, it's going to look a lot different 60 years later than it did when it was new. So how do you deal with those sort of issues as well? So I think, for people who are maybe struggling with how do I rehabilitate or restore a modern landscape, those are probably some of the two issues that come up most often.
Okay, John here again. I think we have time for one final question just to keep us on time. Does anybody in the room have questions? If not, do one of the speakers have a question for another speaker? And I don't see anything being, somebody's typing something in right now, so we'll wait for this to come in and see if it's a question. The question is for Lisa, and the question is, did you consider putting in the pool like Neutra had in the plan or other intended elements that were not implemented?
You're on mute, I think, Lisa.
Lisa, you're unmuted right now.
Are you okay now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I know we discussed the program with the current owners, and they were not interested in having a pool, any kind of a pool. So that element was not put back. What's interesting to think about is if we had put the pool back, it would have created certain implications that are not really addressed in the architectural design, specifically the need to provide protection to keep people from going in the pool from the outside, because right now the property is open and not fully enclosed.
Great, thank you. And I also wanted to leave one final opportunity for the La Jolla Historical Society, who is joining us today through a partnership with La Jolla Historical. And there are 8 people in that room, and if anybody has a question, all you would have to do is type in *6 on your telephone or on the conference line that you're dialing into, and let us know if you have any questions. And I don't see any questions from La Jolla Historical, so I wanted to thank all of our speakers, especially Barbara Lamprecht, who is on our education committee and who has pulled together this all-star cast of people to teach us about mid-century landscapes. Thank you for attending. Through your registration fees, you're supporting our education mission. Given this is the last program of the year, it's a great way to end the year, and I wanted to mention before you leave that we will be posting a survey here momentarily. But while I'm posting it up, I'm going to ask you or request or encourage you, rather, to attend the next webinar that we're planning on, which is the first webinar of the 2015-2016 year, on 10/7, which would be a Wednesday. I think it's next Wednesday, in fact. Evaluating Modern Resources, Tiki, Googie, and Brutalism, presented by Alan Hess, Alex Bevel, and Christopher McMorris. If you use the coupon code CPFMOD, all in caps, you will receive a $10 discount on your registration. If you need to sign in for today's webinar, I posted the link to the sign-in sheet in the chat box earlier, but I'm happy to email it to you. If you sign in, you can get your continuing education credits recorded. I encourage you to look at our website at news.californiapreservation.org/events to learn about all of our upcoming programs. And finally, please do let us know what you thought about today's program. I just reopened the qualitative questions on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side you'll see there's a multiple choice. We ask that you fill that out, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And thanks for your support, and hope to see you more at future programs.
Thank you, John.